hope you had a good break. Thank you for joining us in the talks today. And for those who are joining us for our keynote, welcome. Welcome to Manifest IO. My name is Harshini Karunaratne. I'm one of the co-curators of this event. And this event, Manifest IO, really started as a way to create egalitarian spaces for artists, regardless of background, regardless of where they're from, to create egalitarian spaces for everyone to be represented. And so thank you for supporting us in our mission for arts and arts as a tool for creative expression and so much more. I'm super excited for our keynote today. Gabriel Menotti is going to be our keynote, and we actually know each other for a few years now, so I'm really glad to have him visiting from Brazil/Canada to be with us here in Berlin today. Gabriel Menotti is an associate professor at the Film and Media Department of Queen's University. He holds a PhD in Media and Communications from Goldsmiths University of London and another PhD in Communication and Semiotics from the Catholic University of Sao Paulo. What particularly interests me about Gabriel Menotti's work is that he works primarily in media technology and media research and is the author of Movie Circuits, Curatorial Approaches to Cinema Technology, and the co-editor of Practices of Projection, Histories and Technologies. And I want to welcome you up to the stage and say thank you so much for being here with us.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Rashini, and the whole Manifest team. I'm quite honored to be here and very excited about sharing a little bit of some kind of new research or a new thing. And it's really good to talk after the Spatial Media Lab people, because in a way my presentation will be about communities and infrastructures and sharing resources. It's provisionally called Radical Networks in the History of Brazilian Media Arts. And it's based on a book that I'm finishing right now. It's kind of in the last stages of copy editing, and it should be out this year via Open Humanities Press in open access. I wish I could show you like a nice page in the publisher's website, but we don't have a name still. So I thought this could be a good opportunity to crowdsource opinions. And if you could help me, I made up a pool. And you can use the QR code, you can use the link, and maybe you can vote options, okay? Of course, we are trying to reclaim these terms. By barbarian, we mean what is outside of civilization, and that's very much defined by language. And by bastard, we mean what's illegitimate, in a way. But these are good values from our point of, okay, thank you. Interactive presentation. Anyway, let's keep this in the background. And as I said, it's a book that covers Brazilian media arts, whatever this is, for 50 decades. It's a book basically composed of first sources that's being translated to English in the first time, most of them. So original texts from Brazilian authors, critics, curators, artists. Still, even though it's an anthology, it has kind of an overarching thesis to it. It's very much based on a social history of arts approach. And trying to compare the development of media arts in Brazil to the development of media arts in the global north, in the US and Western Europe. Considering that in the global north, since the beginning, there has been a very clear distinction between, let's say, the contemporary, modern, mainstream art world and technological art world. And this comes from the different resources that each of these kind of artistic expressions require, but it also developed into different institutions, publications, awards, courses, so on and so forth. And I think that we can kind of recognize this more or less everywhere in a way. I think that it wasn't the same in Brazil, perhaps because there was no resources. There was a lot of interest in the post-war for new technologies, just like elsewhere in the world, but there were no resources for people to actually engage on that. So the overarching thesis is that a lot of media arts in Brazil, up to the 90s more or less, was developed within the fold of the post-war avant-gardes. So in a way, technological thinking or technological arts were part of the mainstream art world. And that's more or less what I will be trying to show here today through a series of examples. And I'd like to start with this image from a newspaper. And here, the title is When Poetry and Machine Come Together or Mingle Together. And in the picture, we have Décio Pignatari. It's a concrete poet in Brazil. It's the kind of guy that you study in high school still, you know? It's part of our normal curriculum. And here he is with a computer, interested in this machine, wanting to write poetry with this machine. And that's part of what I want to bring here to all of you. Like our concrete poets, part of a movement that was very much interested in the materiality of text, was also interested in information as a material process. And they were very much connected to intellectuals and other avant-gardes in the whole world that were looking into these same matters. These pictures are part of the ZKM archive, and they were taken by Max Benz. Maybe you're familiar with him. He was a professor, intellectual, philosopher, cultural agitator that was connected to the early computer art scene in Stuttgart in the 60s, and also later with cybernetic serendipity in London, which is kind of acknowledged as the first computer arts, cybernetic arts exhibition. And it's a picture of Haroldo de Campos, who's maybe one of the biggest concrete poets. And Max Benz and these computer art pioneers, they were in contact with the Brazilian concrete poets, and they actually published a lot of work, or some work of them in Germany. And here you have a list of issues of the Rot book series. And as you can see, there is one of the volumes that was publishing work by the Neugrandes poetry group, composed by many of the Brazilian concrete poets, including Décio with the computer and Haroldo. And you also have, for example, an edition of the Futura leaflet, series of booklets, that included the work of Augusto de Campos. And it's a series that also included the work of Frieder Nake, for example, who is a very important German computer arts pioneer. And maybe that's a good thing to show you as an example of what is a concrete poem, just so that you have a sense. But this is the poem that was published in this particular leaflet. It's called Lixo Luxo, and it's the word lixo, trash, written with smaller words, luxo, which is luxury. And of course, there is an interplay of meanings here and the similarity between the words themselves, but also there is this idea of playing with signs on the space of the page, drawing from graphic design, drawing from other dimensions of the word as a medium of expression. And concrete poets, they were very much connected to the cultural elites in São Paulo, especially. They were translating texts, they were bringing Marshall McLuhan, they were bringing Norbert Wiener to Brazil and publishing this in newspapers. The whole issue is that they didn't have access to computers. Brazil, after the World War, was still very much underdeveloped in terms of the industry. And even though there was some kind of window for new technologies in the country, that was really quickly shut down because of a military coup that took place in '64, sponsored by the US. Which is not to say that the military government was not interested in technologies and development, quite the opposite, but they were investing mostly in basic industries, so energy, raw materials, and so on and so forth. The issue is that this created, on the one hand, lack of resources and tools for the artists to work with new media, very broadly speaking, and also a kind of suspicion against technology itself, because it was much more connected with the ideology of development that the government was trying to push for. There are, of course, some exceptions. And maybe the biggest one, when we think about like a Brazilian computer artist pioneer, is Valdemar Cordeiro, who was also connected to the concrete art movement. More specifically, he was a painter. He was within that, that group. And this is a recent exhibition about Valdemar Cordeiro. And he was able actually to do some computer artwork in the 70s. But that's only because he was connected to a scientist, a nuclear physicist in the University of São Paulo, who had in their department one computer. And it might be interesting to show something by him here. So Valdemar Cordeiro, he was a painter. He was interested in the materiality of visual expression. He wanted to use computers, and he found some way to have it done. Quite exceptional, quite an outlier. Maybe one thing to comment on his work is how figurative it is. A lot of early computer art, and even today, when you think about creative coding very broadly, is super abstract. But as you can see here in Cordeiro's work, you have kind of a house. And that's a work called Pirambu, and it's about the outskirts of a city, Fortaleza, where they had slums formed by refugees from water crisis in Brazil. So it's not only figurative, but also it has a kind of social dimension to it. Okay? And one thing that we don't know what could have been in terms of his work is that he passed away very young, at 48 years old. But he took every opportunity he could to try to push forth computers as an artistic medium. In '71, I think, there was an exhibition in the US Intelligence Service Gallery. What? I can't remember the name right now. I think I have it somewhere here. Yeah. United States Information Service Gallery in São Paulo. There was an exhibition called Computer Plotter Art, which was basically bringing works from the US, made by engineers, mostly visualization, nothing really artistic. But Cordeiro made a point in participating. He invited himself to his exhibition so that he could show some of his work. Of course, this was part of cultural diplomacy efforts by the US as a way to promote influence and soft power and connections to Brazil. And for the US Information Service itself, was very good to have someone who brought this kind of cultural capital to their show. For Cordeiro, it was an opportunity to promote his art, and in '71, it would lead to an event at the Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado, a private university in São Paulo called Arteônica, where he not only tried to present most of what his understanding of computer art was through an exhibition, but originally it also included a seminar and kind of this manifesto for a kind of electronic art. Arteônica is like a portmanteau of arte, electrônica, electronic arts. And it's still one of the earlier texts about media, technological arts from Brazil. And in a way, this connection to the concrete poetry and painting movement is present in every pioneer of Brazilian computer arts. You can also see it very clearly in Eduardo Katz's work. Katz is more known by the fluorescent rabbit, but if you look into his first pieces, you see that there is a very strong connection. He made work with holograms, he made works with Minitel. It's very much connected to the work and these other semiotic dimensions of it. And I think that Katz is a very good example of an artist in Brazil that was very interested in these media, and he realized that he couldn't really do it in Brazil no more. So he immigrated to Chicago in '85, I guess, after trying to push for this kind of work a lot. And one thing perhaps to pay attention to is how much all this interest in new media would turn kind of inwards and generate a kind of very acute, almost intuitive understanding of other dimensions of life as media for Brazilian artists, starting with the body itself. So before getting high-tech, so to say, Katz was doing porno poetry, which was very obviously, very literally, a way to inscribe the body back into the text, so to say. And this is just a collected edition, a recent collected edition of his pornographic poems, which also involved performance. So it's not only about writing obscene things, it's about bringing the body into text as an artistic medium that also involves other dimensions of processing. And this would generate a lot of experiments that related to social communication systems more broadly during the dictatorship years. First, because maybe it was one of the channels that Brazilian artists had to exercise their interest in media, but also because it was a way to create alternative communication channels to the ones that were being controlled by the state. One example that's kind of outside of this is this work by Ana Lívia Cordeiro, who is the daughter of Valdemar. And it's a computer-generated choreography who was supported also by the University of Campinas and by TV Cultura in São Paulo, a public TV channel. This is from '73. And as you can see, it's kind of a concrete choreography generated in real time by computer outputs. And the dancers are trying to render these outputs with their bodies. You also see that in works of artists such as Paulo Bruschi, also from Fortaleza, who started investigating Xerox machines, faxes, and mail art as practices for, again, generating new aesthetics, but also creating alternative communication systems. And his work is quite interesting because you see some of the first investigations into a quantification of the body as a form of poetic expression. Here he is doing some of his zero performances, which is basically performances with a Xerox machine. But you also have an image here of his work with how do you say that in English? The machine that measures brainwaves. So he did a performative interaction with it. And this piece is called Feelings, a poem made with the heart. And it's basically, he was working at a public hospital at the time. So once again, you have this kind of windows of opportunity that allows people informally to experiment with new technologies. And you still have poetry at large as a kind of conceptual framework for the development of these early technological artworks in Brazil. But he's very much known for his work with mail art, and he's still very active. And I guess that the work that always comes to mind when you think about this particular time in Brazilian art history is Cildo Meirelles' insertions into ideological circuits, especially the Coca-Cola project. Do you know this work, by the way? It's also very topical for Germany because it's a kind of fund-based artwork. These are glass Coke bottles that must be returned so that you can buy a new Coke. And what he did was to silk screen some messages into the bottles. So you have Yankees Go Home, you have the kind of recipe for a Molotov cocktail, and this one is, I know, which is the place of the work of art. And again, this is part of Tate Modern's collection, so very much inscribed into official mainstream art history. And what is interesting in this work for me is how you are kind of producing a general understanding of media that goes beyond what is a communication channel, like a newspaper or a TV channel at the time. And it's a channel for alternative adversarial messages. This might be relevant because I've just heard that it kind of came back to fashion. It's an intervention made by French artist Fred Forest, who was part of a collective of sociological art during the 12th São Paulo Biennial. There was a section of the biennial on art and communication organized by Willem Flusser, who was living in Brazil at the time. And Fred basically had two pieces or two actions that was part of his participation in the biennial. One was to have these empty ad spaces in local newspapers. So you can buy an ad to sell whatever, Kleinanzeigen style, eBay style, and he just printed empty spaces. And he also did a demo with empty placards, which sounds weird, but it was already kind of a strange thing to do during very repressive time in Brazilian history. Because at the one hand, you're not really producing anything against the regime, but you're creating attention by the mere fact that you have bodies on streets doing stuff. So once again, you have elements of everyday life being presented or being used as media in a very sophisticated way. I'm just skipping some examples, but I can send you the links afterwards in case you are interested. On a similar note, you have works such as Arthur Barrios' Bloody Bags, which were, as the name says, bags full of meat, blood, other forms of detritus that he distributed across the city and were found by people at chance. And of course, this created a lot of tension because people didn't know exactly what these bags were. And it was a time of heavy repression in Brazilian politics. So on the one hand, this generated media facts that were kind of talked about, that were covered by newspapers, but also was a medium in itself to bring to the fore a violence that was part of everyday life. And this is kind of where I want to connect the work of the artists with the work of curators, cultural promoters, and critics, because Barrios projects, for example, and Fred Forest before, and Sildo, were brought into more traditional art institutions by the work of some curators that wanted to expand the scope of Brazilian modern and contemporary art. One of these people that I really like is Frederico Moraes, who has been a super interesting curator, also still alive and working, and that has proposed art criticism to also resort to the same materials that artists do. And part of it was his work with audiovisuals, and that's a very strange medium. It's a kind of precarious video essay kind of thing that took place, or that was very popular in Brazil during the 70s. It's basically a slide projector synchronized with a tape, kind of synchronized. And artists used this as a way to experiment with audiovisual forms of storytelling and expression, but for Frederico, it was a way also to convey criticism, art criticism. And he also organized many exhibitions that attempted to break from the traditional gallery space and occupy the city and bring more of these experimental media artworks into the scope of art. Some other examples of this, you have a curator such as Aracy Amaral, who kind of catalyzed a lot of audiovisual, experimental audiovisual works in the 70s. That's basically things using Super 8, 8mm, slide tapes, and even phonograms. And she did this project called Expo Projeção, Expo Projector, with some collectives of experimental Brazilian filmmakers. And the project has been recuperated by Roberto Moraes, curator, contemporary curator in Brazilian audiovisual media especially. And here you have the case of Videomac, the Museum of Contemporary Arts of São Paulo. During the 70s, they bought a Portapac camera and made it available for artists to generate their movies. And that's something that was quite impossible at the time. Every artist who wanted to make video, and there wasn't many, they had to resort either to some partnership with a commercial production company or someone. And actually before this laboratory, there has been very little experiments with video in Brazil. And this was spearheaded by Walter Zanini, who's also a very important curator in the realm of Brazilian arts, more broadly. And maybe the last thing that I want to underscore in this part of the talk is this book. It's called Rádio Livres, Reforma Agrária no Ar, Free Radios, Land Reform of the Spectrum, which is a book about free radios. And but the interesting thing here is the writer. The main writer is Arlindo Machado, who's probably the most original media theorist in Brazil. He passed away recently, but I think it's quite important to recognize that his work, and he has written on new media, on television, on video, on experimental film, on photography, almost everything. There is this political purchase to his work that also speaks to a lot of these broad Brazilian media arts experiments. He also did some curating, and his work influenced some of the São Paulo Museum Image and Sound program. And that's more or less what we had in Brazil until the 80s, when finally the dictatorship was over, which was also a process in itself. One thing that I maybe didn't make very clear is that for this whole time, it was impossible to import equipment into Brazil. Brazil was trying to develop its own technologies. So the way to do that was to do a complete embargo on things coming from abroad, which made equipment much more expensive. After the dictatorship, the country was kind of invaded by capitalism, so to say, and government policies started to open up for foreign companies, which made computers much more cheap. And you can see how this affects, on the one hand, public imagination and popular culture. And I think that one of the interesting evidences of this change comes from music in Brazil, which has been very much connected to new trends since forever, I guess. This is the manifesto Crabs with the Brain, which is the foundational Mangue Beach manifesto. Mangue Beach is it's a movement and maybe a musical genre from the northeast of Brazil, from Fortaleza especially. And as you can see, still has this textual dimension to it, even though artists were trying to find ways to use new computer technologies in music making. This is from 1992. And it literally evokes the idea of having a parabolic antenna stuck in the mangrove mud as the symbol of this new movement. Or to have a crab remixing antenna, Kraftwerk song, in a computer. So a lot of this harks back to Tropicalia, and when people started importing electric guitars and using what was foreign instruments together with Brazilian popular music. It's a time when you also have interesting side effect of the military dictatorship in labs such as SciArts, which were connected to universities. There was a lot of investment by the military government in some universities that they want to create like elite scientific centers. And this allowed for some groups to, well, let me see if I can have a keep you, to start doing media arts proper, so to say, electronic arts, interactive installations, as early as '95. And this is a group from the University of Campinas as well, which is still maybe the most, or one of the most rich and developed universities in Brazil, public university. Maybe it's worth talking about this before. At that time, as I said, you start to have foreign capital getting into the country. You have financial and telecommunications companies starting to try to get a hold of national markets, so start also to sponsor specific art forms that connect to their agendas. And that's how you see, for example, the creation of a place such as the Itaú Cultural Institute in São Paulo, which was connected to the Itaú Bank, who also had a sort of computer hardware manufacturing branch at some point in the early 2000s. And as early as 2002, they started an electronic arts biennial called Artificial Emotion. At the same time, you see a lot of festivals that brought music together with new media arts. For example, Nokia Trends. And it's very clear how this is like branding initiatives that are mobilized by certain companies connected to new technologies. And also Vivo Arte Móvel is a great example of that. Because these sponsorships, they create the space and the opportunity for finally a sort of proper media art world to exist in Brazil, with access to these new technologies and the possibility of presenting interactive installations with like many screens that will be cast out of more traditional art spaces. Again, all of these festivals, they took place in alternative venues or concert venues. You had Itaú Cultural Institute creating a space for itself that was disconnected from other museums and galleries, which is perhaps where the history of media arts in Brazil comes closer to the history of media arts in the world as a whole. Still, I think there is an interesting underdevelopment that carried on the torch of the avant-gardes, especially when it comes to this connection to other forms of cultural expression that are also maybe evident in the Muggy Beat Manifesto. But this relates to how, in between the 90s and the 20s, you had finally a lot of critical mass organized around global resistance. In Brazil, a catalyst event was the World Social Forum and, of course, the election of the first Workers' Party government, Lula, in 2002. And this was connected to a lot of capillary movements that were trying to use these new technologies to create alternative forms of communication. I think that a lot of it goes back to Indie Media Brazil, the CMI, the Centro de Mídia Independente, and also early movements that started to show interest in free software, free and open software, which got connected to the actual Brazilian government through the Ministry of Culture, who was run by Gilberto Gil at the time. Gilberto Gil is a Tropicalia musician, again, maybe someone that you all know. And here is he in 2003 in a panel that was also integrated by Richard Barbrook and John Perry Barlow on the first Brazilian Media Tactical Media Festival. And I just realized when I was collecting links for this, that this is the YouTube account of Felipe Fonseca, who was also part of these early movements, and there were many groups, Metáfora, Estúdio Livre, Submineralogia, who are trying to use these new technologies not only as a way to produce artworks, but actually to produce new connections and communities and maybe forms of political expression. And one thing maybe to talk about and come full circle when it comes to the Tactical Media Festival is that it took place at Casa das Rosas in São Paulo, which is a center that was originally, or still is, connected to the history of concrete poetry. And the curator of Casa das Rosas at the time was Lucas Bambosi, who's also a video artist, curator, interactive media person, cultural agitator, that kind of is part of a second or third generation of these curators who have been trying to open institutional spaces for other forms of expression. And this is the part that I skipped before, which is arte suporte computador, computer art medium computer. It's weird to translate, which was officially the first computer arts exhibition in Brazil, I guess. And this is the, oops, this is the catalog, which was an attempt to bring together, wow, this was working yesterday, here it is, anyway. To bring together these new art forms, not only in Brazil, but connect them to a kind of international circuit of computer art. So they had an exhibition at Casa das Rosas. It was spearheaded by Lucas Bambosi, and as part of it, they had like a web art contest, which was open to anyone in the world. The winners were Georgie, which is kind of lame, but anyway, they do great work. And they had a jury that was formed by people from all over the world, including like the Banff Center in Canada. So here you have not only media arts being in its own space, but also trying to connect to an alternative network of media arts that's global. And it's, again, kind of outside the mainstream of contemporary arts. And that's kind of it. There's other links here. I can share you the presentation afterwards if you want to check it. And I hope that the book will be out later this year. It will be open access. If you want, you're more than welcome to check it out. And I guess the name will be Barbarian Networks. Who knows? I like it. Thanks so much for the collaboration and for your time and attention.